John Parker's life had been calm and quiet ever since his wife Melanie passed away 5 years ago. Most of his days were spent fixing little things around his small, ranch-style house in Springfield, Missouri. His home sat at the very end of a gravel road, surrounded by wide open fields and a few groups of oak trees here and there. It was a simple life, the kind that leaves you with too much time to think and plenty of space for loneliness to slowly settle in. The day that changed everything started out just like any other. John was sitting in the local diner, the same place where he and Melanie used to enjoy pancakes together on Saturday mornings. He was sipping his coffee, lost in his own thoughts, when a headline in the slightly old newspaper caught his attention. "Local tragedy leaves 2 children orphaned." He read the story carefully twice. Caleb, age 10, and Mason, age 7, had lost their parents in a car crash just outside of town. No close family had come forward to take them in, and now the boys were in the foster care system. John slowly set the newspaper down and stared out the diner window at the empty parking lot. A deep, heavy feeling filled his chest, the kind that doesn't go away easily. His mind drifted back to Melanie's words she had spoken many times when they dreamed about having children. If we can't have our own, maybe we're meant to help the ones who need us. It was like her voice was still in the room with him, even though she had been gone for years. 2 weeks later, John found himself sitting in his lawyer's office, adoption papers spread out across the desk. It was a choice he never thought he would face, but once the idea took hold in his heart, there was no turning back. He wasn't just agreeing to adopt 2 boys, he was opening his home and his heart to a future he couldn't fully see yet. As John signed his name at the bottom of the forms, the lawyer, a kind older man with grey hair, looked at him with a raised eyebrow. "You know people around here are going to talk," the lawyer said. "Are you sure about this?" John paused for a brief second, then kept writing. "Let them talk," he said firmly. By the time he left the office, the papers signed and done, John felt a mix of fear and determination. For the first time in many years, he wasn't just getting through each day, he finally had a reason to move forward. The first time John met Caleb and Mason was at the children's home, a brick building on the edge of Springfield. The place smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and cafeteria food, and the quiet buzz of children's voices filled the hallways. John sat in a hard plastic chair, his hands resting on his knees as he waited. When the boys finally came into the room, John quickly stood up. Caleb, the older brother, was the first to enter. His dark, careful eyes scanned the room until they settled on John. Even though Caleb was only 10, his posture already seemed weighed down, as if he carried too much for someone so young. Right behind him, Mason clung tightly to his brother's shirt, his steps slow and unsure. At just 7 years old, Mason looked so small and fragile, but there was a spark of curiosity in his eyes that John immediately noticed. "Hi, boys," John said, keeping his voice steady even though his heart was beating fast. "I'm John Parker." Caleb didn't answer right away. He just studied John carefully, as if trying to figure out whether this man would be just another temporary adult in his life. Mason leaned close and whispered something to his brother, who gave him a small nod before taking a step forward. "Are you really going to take both of us?" Caleb finally asked, his voice soft but steady. John lowered himself to Caleb's eye level. "That's the only way this works," he said with confidence. "You and Mason stay together, always." Mason peeked out from behind his brother, his lips trembling. "For how long?" he asked, in a tiny voice. "For good," John answered, his words firm and full of meaning. "This isn't just for now. I'm here for the long run. You boys will have a home with me." The room went quiet as the weight of John's promise settled over them. For a moment, neither boy seemed sure if they could really trust him. But then, something changed. Mason let go of Caleb's shirt and slowly reached out his small hand toward John. John didn't hesitate. He gently took the boy's hand in his own, feeling just how much trust was in that simple touch. The ride home was quiet. The only sound was the soft crunch of gravel under the truck's tires. Caleb and Mason sat close together in the back seat, each holding on to their small backpacks tightly. John glanced at them through the rearview mirror, feeling his chest tighten with a mix of protectiveness and doubt. As they pulled into the driveway, Mason finally broke the silence. It was the first thing he had said since they left the children's home. "It's big," he said, looking at the house. "It's home," John answered softly. He led the boys inside and showed them their shared bedroom. It was small but cozy, with 2 matching twin beds and a window that looked out over the backyard. Caleb carefully set his backpack on the floor, his eyes quietly scanning the room. Mason, on the other hand, quickly jumped onto one of the beds, gently bouncing on the mattress. John cleared his throat. "Listen," he began, his voice low and calm. "I know all of this is new, and maybe it's a little scary right now, but I want you to know something very important. This isn't just for a little while. This is your home now, and I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here for you, no matter what." Caleb's jaw tightened, and for a moment John thought he might argue or refuse to believe him. But instead Caleb gave a small nod. Mason whispered softly, "Promise?" "I promise," John replied firmly. In that moment, John knew he had made the right choice. No matter what challenges they would face them together. The first few weeks tested John in ways he hadn't expected. Caleb and Mason had lived through more pain than most grown-ups could ever imagine, and it showed. Caleb kept his feelings locked up tight, rarely speaking unless someone asked him something directly. Mason was different. He was full of nervous energy, sometimes crying suddenly or laughing in sharp bursts that didn't quite feel real. And then there was the town. Springfield wasn't the kind of place where people kept quiet about things. The gossip started quickly. At the grocery store, a neighbor glanced at John's shopping cart filled with snacks and kids' cereal, her face showing both surprise and quiet judgment. At church, people whispered as John walked in with the boys. Their young faces stood out in a crowd of familiar ones. Before long, the quiet talk turned into obvious actions. The hardware store somehow ran out of the paint John wanted for the boys' room. The local diner was suddenly fully booked whenever John and the boys showed up for breakfast. John also heard quiet comments at town council meetings. People spoke in carefully chosen words about unusual families and keeping the community the way it's always been. 86. One afternoon, while Caleb and Mason were playing basketball in the driveway, an older couple walked by. The man glared at them and muttered loudly enough for Caleb to hear, "He'll regret it." John, who had been cleaning tools in the garage, stepped outside just in time to see Caleb freeze in place, the basketball still in his hands. His face showed nothing, but John could see the tension in his shoulders. John walked over and placed a steady hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Don't listen to them," John said firmly. "Some people talk because they don't know how to think. You're here because you belong here. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." Caleb nodded, but John could tell the boy was struggling to truly believe it. Nighttime was the hardest. Mason had terrible nightmares, so vivid and frightening they would send him running into John's room, crying. The first time it happened, John sat with him on the edge of the bed, wrapping his arm around the small, shaking boy. "Was it about the accident?" John asked gently. Mason nodded and buried his face in John's chest. "I miss them," he whispered. "I know you do," John said, his throat tightening with emotion. "It's okay to miss them. It's okay to be sad. But I'm here now, Mason. You're not alone anymore." Mason held on to John even tighter, and for the first time, John felt like he was beginning to reach past the walls the boys had built around themselves. But Caleb was harder to reach. He carried himself with a quiet strength that made it difficult for John to know what he was really feeling. One evening, while John was fixing a broken step on the front porch, Caleb came over holding a small wooden box. "What's this?" John asked, wiping his hands on his jeans. Caleb hesitated, then handed him the box. Inside were photographs, a mix of family pictures and candid moments of his parents. "I don't want Mason to see these yet," Caleb said softly. "He's not ready." John nodded, carefully closing the box. "You're a good big brother," John told him. "You look out for him." Caleb shrugged, but John caught a flicker in his eyes, maybe pride. "It's just what I do," Caleb said. Even with all the struggles, there were small wins. Mason started laughing more, the real kind of laughter that filled the house with warmth. Caleb, still serious, grew interested in John's woodworking projects. He would quietly watch as John showed him how to sand and stain wood. The boys were slowly healing. John knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt real hope. Spring came early that year, bringing warmer days and clearer skies. John saw it as a chance to help the boys get more involved in the community, even though the town still seemed unsure about them. He signed them up for youth sports, Caleb for basketball, and Mason for soccer, and planned for all of them to help at the upcoming town cleanup day. But their first game day didn't go as smoothly as John had hoped. Caleb, dressed in his new basketball jersey, stepped onto the court with his team. Right away, he felt the eyes of the parents watching from the sidelines. John noticed them too, some whispering, some stealing glances between Caleb and him. When the game began, Caleb's skill quickly became clear. He was fast, sharp, and completely focused. By halftime, even the most doubtful parents had to admit, this kid could really play. But even after the final whistle, the air still felt heavy with unspoken things. As Caleb walked off the court, one of the parents, a man wearing a baseball cap and a hesitant look, came over. He offered his hand. "He's got real talent," the man said gruffly. "You must be proud." John shook his hand firmly. "I am. He's worked hard." It wasn't a long answer, but it was a beginning. At the town cleanup day, something else shifted. Volunteers gathered in the town square holding brooms, garbage bags, and gloves. John and the boys joined a group assigned to repaint the old gazebo. As they worked, Mason's non-stop chatter floated through the air, making some of the older volunteers smile. "Mr. Parker," one woman said, wiping her hands on her apron as she paused for a break, "Mason makes the work feel easier. He's a bright one." "He is," John replied, watching Mason laugh as he carefully tried to paint a straight line along the gazebo railing. Caleb, much quieter, painted steadily beside him, his brush strokes neat and smooth. As the day went on, more people started talking to the boys. Caleb impressed some of the older men when he fixed a shaky bench with steady hands. Mason, full of energy, gathered a few younger kids to help pick up trash around the park. By the end of the day, something in the air had changed. People weren't just tolerating John and the boys anymore, they were starting to truly welcome them. The real turning point came when Mason entered the town's annual Spring Festival art contest. He worked for days on his painting, a tender portrait of his late parents, filled with color and feeling. John wasn't sure how the town would react. On the day of the festival, Mason's painting was displayed alongside many others in the town square. People stopped to look, their faces softening as they studied the emotion Mason had poured into his work. When the winners were announced, Mason's name rang out across the square. The applause that followed was real, warm, and loud. As Mason stepped forward to collect his ribbon, John saw something different in the crowd. The quiet judgment was gone. That night, as they walked home, Caleb spoke softly. "It feels different." "What does?" John asked. "People," Caleb replied, glancing back at the festival lights still glowing in the square. "They're not looking at us the same anymore." John smiled. "That's because they're starting to see what I've seen all along. Two incredible kids who truly belong here." Late one afternoon, the storm the local news had warned about for days finally arrived. It started as a low rumble, and soon dark clouds rolled in, turning the sky a heavy grey. Winds whipped through John's backyard, bending the trees. Caleb and Mason stood by the living room window, their faces a mix of curiosity and fear. "Is it going to be bad?" Mason whispered. John placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Storms can be rough, but this house has been through worse. We'll be all right." The lights flickered, then went out completely. John grabbed a flashlight and led the boys down to the basement. The sound of rain pounding on the roof was deafening, mixed with sharp cracks as tree branches snapped in the wind. Caleb sat close to Mason, his arm wrapped tightly around his younger brother. When the storm finally passed, John brought the boys back upstairs. They stepped outside to see the damage, roof shingles scattered across the yard, broken branches everywhere, and part of the fence leaning dangerously. Across the street, a neighbor's roof had partly collapsed. Sirens wailed in the distance as emergency crews rushed through the flooded roads. John took a deep breath and turned to the boys. "Let's get to work," he said. "There are people who need help." The next few days were busy and full. John and the boys spent nearly every hour helping neighbors repair their homes. They cleared fallen trees, boarded up broken windows, and passed out supplies at the community center. Mason's cheerful spirit made him a favorite among the neighbors. One day, he handed a bottle of water to an elderly woman who gently patted his cheek. "You've got a good heart, young man," she told him. Caleb, quieter but just as committed, worked hard beside John. He spent long hours helping patch roofs and steady damaged walls. A neighbor, one who had barely spoken to John before, stopped by and said simply, "You're raising good boys." "I'm just helping them be who they already are," John answered. The storm had brought the whole town together in a way no one expected. People who once kept their distance now worked side by side with John and the boys. At the community potluck, held to thank the volunteers, Mason and Caleb sat among their new friends, laughing and swapping stories as if they'd always belonged in Springfield. When the mayor stepped up to speak, he paused to mention John and the boys. "In times like these we see people's true hearts," he said. "John Parker and his sons have shown us what it really means to care for each other, no matter what." The crowd's applause was loud and lasting. For the first time, John felt the town had truly accepted his family. That evening, as they sat around the table, eating leftovers from the potluck, Mason looked at John. "Do you think Mom and Dad would be proud of us?" he asked softly. John put down his fork, his throat tightening. "I know they would," he said firmly. "And I'm proud of you too." Caleb glanced at Mason, then back at John. "We're proud of you too," he said. The words were simple, but filled the room with something that made John's heart feel full. The weeks after the storm marked a quiet change for John, Caleb, and Mason. Slowly, doors that once seemed shut in Springfield began to open. People who used to avoid them now waved in passing, and instead of whispered disapproval, real conversations began. Their work during the storm had left a lasting impression. One Saturday, as Caleb and Mason played basketball in the driveway, a car pulled up. It was Mr. Peterson, a man who had once been one of their loudest critics. He stepped out holding a small toolbox. "I heard you're fixing that old gazebo in the park," he said awkwardly. "Figured you might need another set of hands." John hesitated, then reached out to shake his hand. "We could use the help," he said. That afternoon, Caleb worked alongside Mr. Peterson, sanding the gazebo's rails while Mason helped apply a new coat of paint. By the end of the day, the once-forgotten structure looked fresh and strong again. Mr. Peterson even stayed long enough to share lemonade with them on the porch. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was something. The change in the town spread further. Caleb's basketball team organized a fundraiser to help families still recovering from the storm. Mason suggested they also donate some of the money to fix the playground at the community center. When Mason shared his idea, some of the kids seemed unsure. "What if we don't raise enough?" one boy asked. Mason just smiled. "Then we keep trying until we do." The fundraiser was a success, and when Mason handed the check to the community center's director, even those who had once doubted them began to soften. But not everyone changed right away. At a town council meeting, Mrs. Aldridge, an older woman known for her sharp words, stood up to speak. "I still think all this is happening too fast," she said, her voice no longer as sharp as it once was. Before John could say anything, Caleb raised his hand and stood. The room went quiet. "People can change," Caleb said, his voice calm. "If we can, you can too." His words hung in the air, and Mrs. Aldridge quietly sat down, her face thoughtful. The real moment of belonging came at Springfield's 4th of July celebration. The fireworks show was the biggest event of the year. John, Caleb, and Mason arrived early to help set up tables and chairs. As the sun set, the park filled with families, and the air buzzed with excitement. When the fireworks began, Mason climbed onto John's lap, his face glowing with each burst of color in the sky. Caleb sat beside them, peaceful and amazed. As the final firework painted the sky in gold and silver, John looked around. For the first time, it didn't feel like they were just being accepted. It felt like they truly belonged. Mason leaned against John's chest. "We really belong here, don't we?" John smiled, his eyes glistening. "Yeah, buddy, we do." 10 years passed, and Springfield slowly changed. New shops lined the streets. The old playground, once falling apart, was now full of children's laughter. The gazebo Caleb and Mason had helped repair still stood tall, a quiet reminder of what the town had overcome. But the most important changes weren't in the buildings, they were in the people. John's house had become a place where neighbors gathered, where kids shot basketballs in the driveway, and where everyone felt welcome. His sons had grown into men with their own paths, each shaped by the lessons they learned in that little house at the end of the gravel road. Caleb, now 20, was studying architecture at the University of Kansas. He came home on weekends to help with town projects, often bringing his designs to life. His latest was a mural, telling the story of the storm and how the town had come together afterward. Mason, 17, had taken a different road. His gift for connecting with people led him to run youth programs at the community center, creating spaces where every kid had a chance to succeed. On a warm summer evening, the town gathered at the community center for a special ceremony. A plaque was revealed, reading, "In honor of the Parker family for showing us what it truly means to be a community." John stood at the back, watching Caleb speak about building places where people could come together. Mason shared stories of the kids he'd helped and how simple kindness could change a life. When the speeches ended, Caleb found John near the snack table. "We couldn't have done any of this without you," he said. John shook his head, his voice soft. "No, son. You both found your own way. I just gave you the tools." Mason joined them, holding 2 plates of pie. "I saved the last pieces for us," he said, with a grin. John laughed as he took a plate. "Glad to see some things never change." The three of them sat on a bench by the playground, eating in easy silence. As the sky darkened and stars appeared, Caleb suddenly said, "I think Mum would have been proud." John looked at his sons, pride filling his chest. "She would have been, and so am I." They sat quietly, listening to the distant sound of laughter, a soft reminder of the journey they'd all made together. Caleb and Mason had grown into men of kindness and strength, leaving behind a legacy of their own. And as the night settled around them, John realized the house he'd built hadn't just been a shelter. It had been the start of something much bigger, something that would carry on long after them,